So today we're going to be painting some pre-1806 French infantry. These are metal miniatures on little strips, molded by and made by, produced by Bacchus 6mm. Really nice sculpts. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to clean up the models. Most of the time these are already pretty well molded, so we don't really have a lot of cleanup, just a few bits here and there. But what will happen is that in the transit process, some of the infantrymen will have bent over, or their muskets will have bent a little bit. So there's not an awful lot of flash to remove. You just want to make sure that they're nice and straight as much as possible. Some variations, not really a big deal. Whenever these are ranked up, you're not really going to notice much about them. But I am going to take a hobby knife to various different things and try and clean up a few things. But as I said, not much flash here to clean. So before we get on to painting the miniature, the first thing we're going to do after we do cleanup is we're going to wash the miniature, literally with just some hand soap or dishwashing soap or whatever it is, because a lot of companies will use some sort of mold release agent to ease the process of removing the miniatures from the mold. But that can have problems with adherence of the paint, and so we want to remove that. So we just get some soap and just literally wash it a little bit. You can even just make a basin of hot soapy water if you want, and like stick them in there. And then after you've done that, you just rinse them properly with some water, and then let them air dry, and then later on they'll be ready for priming and painting. The next thing is we're going to put our strips onto a little tongue depressor I have here. So I'm just going to put a few blobs of PVA glue along the base of this tongue depressor. I usually just stick to about 4 strips on each tongue depressor. I don't like to get too many on there because it tends to be a little bit difficult to paint the details and things like that, but a few is okay. Make sure that they're all kind of facing the same way as much as possible. Oh, that one's the wrong way around. I also like to leave a little bit of space at the end so that I can just hold it a little bit more easily. So once those are on, the next step will be to prime them. So the next step then is to undercoat them. Yeah, I'm just going to do it in black because this really saves you a lot of hassle in the long run by giving you some natural shadows. So some people like white, I prefer black, just I guess from my years of wargaming. So I'm just using a simple, straightforward black, Vallejo black. I'm just going to cover the whole model with that. Just make sure you get a good, even coverage, but not too thick because you don't want to obscure the details on these very nice models. You want to go in there and get everything done really nicely. Make sure you don't miss any parts because that'll really stand out in the long run if you do. The next step in this process then is to prime the miniatures. I'm going to be using a Vallejo primer, German Panzer Gray, with a little drop of airbrush thinner just to make the drying process a little bit slower and to thin out the paint a little bit. So I like to use this. I have in the past used just flat black primers, but I like the gray and just the difference it can give me. So you want to just make sure you get a nice even coat. Doesn't need to be too perfect because so long as you've got some on there, the primer will do its work. It's just a very thin polymer coating which is going to allow the paint to adhere there nicely. So you want to do front and back of the minis, and then you'll be on to painting them next. So usually you'll want to leave this for 12 to 24 hours. I usually do it the night before I want to paint them, so tomorrow maybe I'll paint these, so tonight I'll prime them. So now we're going to start painting the minis now that we have them primed. So I'm just going to use some relatively cheap brushes that I bought online, synthetic brushes. What's really more important with painting these small miniatures is the point on your brush rather than anything else, I guess. That's critical. Now, what else you're going to want to make sure is, like, the color I'm going to use for the base of this is going to be dark Prussian blue from my blue jackets, and then I'm going to just do a nice layer on that. So typically I'm going to be wanting to do an inside out technique, primarily because I'm not the steadiest or greatest of painters, and it just allows me to pick out the details on the top, like for example the various belts and accoutrements later on. Right now I'm just going to paint the blue over the jacket, being quite messy with it, but that's okay at this stage because we will clean it up later. So once we've got all of those done on the strips, the next step will be to change the color. Next will be to paint the red on the cuffs and on the collars. So for this I'm using Vallejo flat red. Again, don't need to be super neat because a lot of this will get covered up by the flesh tone later on. So just do your best to get a good coverage. Next I'm going to paint the wood and the backpacks, just using any old brown. I'm using flat brown for that, but any old sort of wooden colored brown will do. So just make sure to get all of the rifle wood stock painted up, and then on the back don't forget about the backpacks. So the base for the backpacks can be this brown as well, and that'll really bring that to life. So make sure you get that nice and covered. You need to be a little bit more neat at this point because you're not going to go back over things quite the same way anymore. Next up is the flesh. So we're going to be using beige red for that, and it's just going to be on the faces and the hands of the minis. So you need to be a little bit careful with this, as I said before. We're getting to the critical stages now. So we just want to like be not really having to do it for a lot of detail, but like a little dab on the face, a little dab on the hands. Basically this becomes a dot 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 process. And then look for the hand down here, like that. So okay, so we just do that on all of them, and then we come back for the next stage. Now it's time for the bedrolls. We're going to be using sky gray for that, but really any light gray will do. You just want to make sure you line along the top there, really help it pop out. So nice like that. The next part then is using our iron breaker to just paint the tops of the bayonets. Just make sure you do the front and the back like that, and it will come up really nicely. Our next step then is the strapping, which we're going to be using a slight off gray, off white color, just using some white gray there, which will give us hopefully a nice bright layer to just lift up the colors of the mini. So you want to be very careful with this stage because we don't want to go back anymore to the earlier stages at all. So it's just going to be the trousers and the various strapping on the minis. The last part of the basic paint scheme is the hats and boots, and so for that we're going to be using German grey, which is a nice off black color, just to paint up those bike horns and those boots. So this is the last stage. We want to be super careful. We don't want to have to go back over any areas or anything like that as much as possible. So just make sure you cover it up nicely, and make sure to do the boots as well. And then that's it for the basic paint job. And if we're going to go a little bit further, then what we're going to do is we're going to shade and wash our minis. I like to use Agrax Earthshade. I think it gives a nice dirty-ish look, which really just shows that these guys have been in the field for a considerable length of time. So the important thing here is that you don't pool it, because that can really obscure some of the details and we'll get a chalky finish at the end. So we want to just have a really light shading, and we do not want to get it too much, too deep, but it will help to pick out some of those details, especially if you're like me, a little bit untidy with the different strappings and things like that. So we just do that, do front and back like normal. The next step then is, after the wash, is to add a little bit more depth and to pick out some of those colors. So we want to use a white color here just to pick out some of the details on the chest of the model. Don't forget the trousers as well. This will just really make the minis pop from a distance of about 2 feet, which is realistically why most people are going to see these. You could spend a lot of time really going in there for the details, but it's probably not going to be worth your while. So yeah, just get those all done, and then on to the next step. So next we're going to want to pick out the armor, or sorry, the jackets. We're going to do that with a nice bright blue color, just to make those really pop. So I'm not being as neat with these as I would with my 28mm miniatures, because realistically you're not going to see a huge amount of detail on these anyway whenever you're actually wargaming. So it's not really worth your while to like spend tons and tons of time on these. Getting them to a playable standard is sufficient. So make sure you pick out those colors nice and bright. See you in the next step. The next step then is going to be to pick out the jackets with a nice brighter blue color. So in this case we're going to go with this one, and we're just going to paint that over the top of the jacket as it stands, being a little bit more careful than we have in the previous steps. Like I said, I don't really care so much about being very particular with 6mm figures. I just want them to be clearly distinguishable from the other armies on the battlefield, and that's really sufficient for me. Okay, don't forget also to do the back on there. Make sure to get the jackets painted, trying not to go over the detail from the previous steps too much, so you don't have to go back and do that again. Okay, see you in the next step. The next stage then is of course to highlight the skin tone. So just use a basic skin tone for that. And remember, this is a highlight, not a base coat of the skin tone, otherwise it's kind of a bit unnatural. But for some of the higher points of the skin, it's not too bad. So just try to be a little bit neat with this step. Kind of just picking out some of the details. It can be a nose here, chin, and so on. Not the easiest thing to do. Just want to get pretty good like that. Okay. The next step then will be to do the stock of the barrel. So you'll need a nice bright brown for that, so a bit like a flat brown or whatever from Vallejo. It's quite nice. Just gonna need two. just sort of pick out the base a bit, the stock. Again, as always, trying to be quite neat with this. You don't have to go back over the other parts later on. The next step then is to pick out the red again, just using our flat red from Vallejo. Just getting those cuffs and various different other red parts picked out. So again, trying to be as careful as possible. Next, we'll do a small highlight of the hat and also the boots using some basalt gray. You can see it there. So you really just want to be going over the tops of these hats a little bit, just to pick it out here and there. It doesn't need to be everything, just maybe the tops of the boots, just to make it pop a little bit. Because I mean, one of the things that makes 6mm figures really stand out is some eccentric highlights here and there. Makes them just pop that a little bit more. Of course, you don't need to do this step. I just like to make sure that my miniatures pop a little bit so that they have a little bit more visual feel, just for my own personal desires. The last step then is to just go over the metal again and make it pop a little bit more. So again, that's with our Citadel color iron breaker. So most of the metal is just on the top of the bayonets. Some of that can really dull down during the period where we washed the minis. So this is the last step in the advanced painting. We'll go over the basing, but for now the minis are more or less done. Don't forget, of course, to do the backs of the bayonets as well, and that will really help those pop quite a bit. Then just come back for the next step, which will be basing. Okay, now that the minis are more or less complete, the next stage is to just do the bases. So I usually just paint the base of the strips using some flat earth, a little bit watered down to make sure it flows a little bit easier, and then just get a good even coverage on there. You want to be a little bit careful, but at the same time, we're going to be putting some static grass on here. You might need to do a couple of coats just to make sure you get a good coverage of the brown, so that there's not really too much of the undercoat showing through, because brown can be a little bit opaque, or sorry, like transparent, which can really affect the visual appeal. So the last step then is to put a little bit of static grass on there of the basing. So put a few dabs of Elmer's glue all on there, so, or any real PBA glue actually will do, just along the base, and then we'll go through and we'll stick some static grass on there just to give it a little bit of a pop. So you can see I'm dabbing it on, not being too particular about where, just so long as I'm not on the minis. And then you're going to want to get your static grass and just put a few pinches here and there. Just dab it in and around. Okay, and then top off any excess. And there you have it. Some French infantry in a field. So here they are, all based up and ready to go and looking quite lovely. So Thank you for watching, and make sure to check out the other videos on my channel. See you next time.